cops and other law enforcement people of Reddit, what were some cases you worked on that made you think that something supernatural/paranormal was going on? I worked for 911, and one time I received a call from an off-duty officer who had rushed to his home because his teenage son, who was there, said he heard something in a back room of the residence as if someone was there. The son said he heard things move in the room and the door slam. The officer, who I was on the line with, wanted an officer to help him clear the residence, make sure no one unauthorized was inside. Because I thought it was a breaking and entering in progress, I stayed on the line with him. While I had him on the line, I looked up the history of that home. Apparently, an older gentleman had died in the house about a year earlier. After I saw that, I managed to ask how long they had been in the house, and the man said they had recently moved in. After backup arrived on the scene, they determined there was no one else in the house. Yikes. I knew in my heart it was the old man who died there. My boyfriend is an officer as well, and he told me a story once where he responded to a house where a lady said she heard something in her kitchen. He and his partner cleared the house and then were talking to the lady in the living room, telling her that all seemed to be in order. They all heard a noise in the kitchen. When they went into the kitchen, all of the cabinets were open, and the chairs at the table were all leaning against the table. He said the lady who lived in the home freaked out and left the house with them. I am a cop in Alaska. I worked nights and was in the outskirts of town. Myself and two other officers responded to a family's house where they heard someone howling like a wolf under their back deck. While I was on my way, another officer called me and said that he had been to the neighbor's house earlier. The department had a few problems with the neighbor, who had called several times saying someone was breaking into his house, but there was no one there. And there were no tracks in the fresh snow. That night, the neighbor thought someone was breaking into his house again. He called the cops and went outside to confront the person. When he went outside, he didn't find anyone but thought he saw someone in his window, so he shot at his own house. When the police arrived, there was no evidence of anyone entering the house. The general consensus was that the neighbor was crazy. So, while we were heading to the call, we thought the crazy neighbor had gone under the deck and was howling. When we got there, we spoke to the homeowner, and they asked us to walk around the house. We didn't find any footprints. The other officers looked into the woods a little bit, and I spoke to the homeowner. They said they swore they heard howling under their deck. The wife mentioned that a week earlier, she saw the police go to the neighbor's house, and when the police walked around the house, a skinny man with a dark jacket and long dark hair ran around from the other side of the house and into the woods. We looked further into the woods and found tracks that led to another person's house, then further into the woods where we lost the trail. We told them to lock their doors and to call us next time they heard or saw anything. Maybe the neighbor wasn't crazy after all. Security officer. So I'm contracted to a metal foundry in the middle of nowhere. Although I am skeptical, I can say without a doubt there are some strange occurrences here. Firstly, on the back of the site, there is an old graveyard from the smallpox epidemic in the 1800s. All the officers see things out of the corner of their eye. For me, one night I entered and I heard very dry coughing from the far corner. Of course, no one was there. The big event that spooked me, though, was when I was patrolling through the main offices one night and saw a door at the end of a hall close. No one should be up here, and I am the only officer on site, so I take off running for the door. I get to it and swing it open to find another door hurriedly shutting further down the hallway. There's no way someone could have gotten that far ahead of me that quickly. I rush over, and when I open it, I see another door to an office room close. Whoever it is, they are cornered. I burst in, and there is no one. Not a soul. Things like this happen weekly. I've even started finding pentagrams, of all things, scrawled around the plant, as well as random children's dolls. Need to check if my contract covers demons. I worked undercover narcotics from the mid-1990s through the mid-2000s. Back then, crack and cocaine were still king, and being Latino, I was able to infiltrate the Dominican crews selling out of the multi-family apartment buildings in Washington Heights, NYC. These were mostly middle to upper level cases where I'd buy ounces up to a couple of kilos before making arrests. Building these cases typically took upwards of 6 months to a year due to the need to establish connections and comply with legal and budgetary constraints. Anyway, I developed a case with this one guy and his crew. Starting with small purchases like a couple of ounces to gain his trust, I always posed as a dealer with my own business. With these guys as my suppliers, weeks turned into months, and I built a rapport with this guy, making occasional buys. He trusted me enough that for my last buy, I scheduled to purchase 2 kilos from him at his place. In these operations, I always wore a wire and had half a dozen backup guys nearby, either shadowing me or ready to intervene if needed. I got the final go-ahead from my contact and notified my team that I was exiting the car and proceeding on foot. As soon as I left the car, a feeling of dread washed over me, a cold sensation that something bad was imminent. I was accustomed to nerves but never this intense, chilling fear in my gut. As I walked down the block, I tried to shake it off, but my senses were heightened, like walking the Green Mile to the electric chair. I felt myself trembling, then a voice inside me kept repeating, "Don't go, don't go, don't go." Despite trying to push through, I felt weighed down by an eerie chill. I became paranoid, feeling like everyone on the block saw me as a marked man. This was a new level of fear for me, despite years of undercover work. Finally, I gave in and walked past the apartment building, wiping sweat from my face, and called off the operation. I returned to my car with tears in my eyes from the fright, and informed the guy that I had to reschedule for later that evening. He understood and told me to call when ready. I regrouped with my team at a staging area, the fear gradually subsiding, and I began to feel like myself again. A few hours later, around the time I was originally supposed to be at the apartment, the sergeant received a call from the homicide unit. Apparently, my contact and two others inside the apartment had pulled out guns and shot each other down. Blood, bullet casings, kilos of cocaine, and chaos ensued. Was I supposed to be part of that deadly equation? I'll never know, and I'll never ask. I continued with undercover operations for years after that incident and never experienced that level of fear again. Not my story. I love these kinds of stories and often ask people if anything strange has ever befallen them. I don't use the word paranormal because people get edgy around that word. This is a story I heard from a guy I worked with in the Air Force while stationed at Osanab in South Korea in 2003. He said that when he was at his first duty station in Germany, about 10 years prior, he and another airman were rooming together in a small basement apartment off base. One night, he wakes up in his tiny room to see a dark shadow person standing in front of his window. He jerks fully awake, and it's gone. The thing is, the bed is actually pushed against that window, so there isn't room for a person to stand. He assumes he was dreaming but is too rattled to go back to sleep. After tossing and turning for hours, he gives up and gets up. The same thing happens the next night, so he risks ridicule and asks his housemate if they'd been in his room the previous night around 3 a.m. The answer is no, accompanied by ridicule. This happens to him every night for the next 2 weeks at 3 a.m. Eventually, it doesn't really shock him anymore. He sees the figure, tries to focus on it, and it disappears. He knows he won't sleep, so he gets up around 3:15, makes coffee, and watches TV until it's time for work. One morning, during his usual routine, he's just sitting down on the couch with coffee in hand when a fireball shoots out of the stove that heats the apartment and ignites a dried-up houseplant a couple of feet away. He jumps up and puts the fire out by throwing the plant in the bathtub, and he was never bothered by the dark shadow again. I am a detective for a sheriff's office in Tennessee. One night, I was called to the scene of a death. The victim had died of a gunshot wound to the head. Once there, I located the victim lying on the floor of an unfinished basement. The victim's spouse was an employee of our sheriff's office, so I ended up asking for the State Bureau of Investigation to handle the investigation to eliminate any conflict of interest. I was told that their response would be delayed by over 4 hours because they were working a homicide across the state and it would take a few hours to close up what they were doing and travel to my location. Another detective and I agreed to wait at the crime scene until they arrived. Since I was already on scene, I agreed to take the first 2 hours to provide scene security. I sent our deputies back in service to handle calls, leaving me at the scene by myself. I began my watch by sitting in a chair next to an exit door in the basement, leaving the body in eyesight approximately 50 feet away. After 45 minutes, I was surfing the web on my phone when I heard a loud hissing sound followed by what sounded like an open hand smack on a flat surface. The sounds came from where the victim was lying. The house had been cleared and locked down before I sent the deputies back in service. The only way in or out was the door at which I was sitting. After this, I went outside, pulled my car up to the door, and sat there with the engine running. I mentioned the occurrence to the medical examiner, and she laughed, saying that she hears all kinds of weird noises coming from bodies. I'm pretty sure the hissing sound was gas escaping the body, but the loud smack I cannot explain. I know you asked for police/firefighters and first responder responses, but I just had to share this story. I am a cable technician for Comcast in the Portland, Oregon/Vancouver, Washington area. I was working close to downtown Portland a few years ago when I had a job for an installation at a Roman-style apartment. You know the kind. The building is square with a huge common court in the center. I was training a new employee, so he was riding along with me. We got to the residence and met with a really sweet older woman. She explained what she wanted and then asked what she should do with her satellite equipment. Working for Comcast, I said I had no clue. She then explained that she was originally going to have satellite. But when the technician came to do the install, he had to run new lines to her apartment to provide service. He went into the basement, and where her apartment is, the basement has one access that is padlocked and bolted shut. The original owner of the building had done this, and the new owner did not know why. Anyway, the tech went down to do the work, leaving the equipment in the customer's apartment to install once all the lines were run. Hours passed, and she heard nothing from this satellite tech. She went to look for him. His truck was gone, and his tools and cable were in the basement. She called the company she had requested service from and was told the technician left and refused to go back to the building. No explanation was given. That is what she was told. Now I am there and notice I have to run new lines. So I take the new employee, leave my equipment in her apartment, and proceed to the basement. Here is where I started feeling really off, and honestly, I was a little scared. As she got to the door that was barred and padlocked, I had my headlamp and my Maglite Mini on hand. As I opened the door, I noticed it was pitch black. I mean dark. My new employee refused to go in. I walked in, and first off, the creepiest thing I have ever seen was a huge boiler, like the heart of the house in the movie Monster House. Anyway, I had to go to the far side of the basement to run the cable and attach it to the overhead beams. I felt severe apprehension at being in there, like someone was staring murder at me. The new tech left me down there, taking one of the lights with him. So I started talking to myself, apologizing for being in the space and saying I wouldn't be there long. I was apologizing for things I did when I was 5. Just to apologize, I felt that was what was needed. I was a little more than halfway done and still apologizing when I was forcefully pushed into the wall in front of me. I finished my work and quickly backed out of the room. When I got back out of the basement, my heart was pounding, and my back started to burn. I asked Jacob to look at my back, and he saw what looked like hot spots on my back. He put his fingers up, and they matched fingertips. There were 10 marks, like I was pushed. I told him what happened. He sat in the truck and quit at the end of the day. As scary as that was, it was the coolest thing to have happened to me. Thanks for letting me share. My husband is a cop, and he told me this story a while back. He had been called to investigate an alarm going off at a house in the town where he works. The alarm was tripped from inside the house, not like a perimeter alarm. So my husband and another officer get to the house, and it turns out it's totally vacant. Nothing too weird about that. Could be a transient or squatter who's broken in and is living in the empty house and set off the alarm, right? Well, they check all the doors, windows, and any other potential points of entry. Everything is intact and locked up tight. No signs of forced entry. So they start looking through windows, shining their lights in to see if they can figure out what set off the alarm. They see absolutely nothing, other than a completely empty house and a single framed photo hanging on the wall of an old woman sitting in a chair. Looked to be from about the 1920s or so. They never did find any evidence of anyone breaking into the house, and to this day, my husband has no idea why the alarm had gone off. Not the scariest story, but spooky nonetheless. I've been on patrol for several years and love stuff like this. I had a backup officer with me who witnessed everything. Dispatch sent me to a call in a mountain area late one night. Dispatch said the caller reported several people holding a baby above their heads and chanting while standing on her property. The call sounded ridiculous, and I smirked as dispatch gave the details. I arrived at the proper address after driving about 20 minutes along a mountain road. There isn't much else up here, and it was extremely quiet. No one walks around out here, and there aren't very many cars driving this late. I walked along a gated driveway through a lightly wooded area. I found the caller's house with 2 dim lights near the front door. The house was surrounded on 3 sides by heavy woods. I felt a little uneasy just looking at the house. I knocked on the front door of the house while standing on a large patio. I heard something move to my left, which startled me because it was close. It sounded like a person, something big. I looked to the left and used my flashlight to light up the patio. I didn't see anyone. I continued to knock. I could hear 2 voices inside the house, clearly a male and a female. This made me feel a little better. I thought I heard someone on the patio, but it must have been someone inside. The female eventually opened the door. She was terrified, almost crying. She asked me to come inside and close the door. She led me to the living room, where I saw a very cheap security monitor setup, almost like a baby monitor camera setup, with audio and video playing. The camera setup only provided a live feed. The camera was positioned to view the front door and patio area where I had just been standing. The audio was silent as I watched the monitor for a few seconds. The woman began to explain when I interrupted and asked where the male was inside the house. Since I heard his voice, she looked confused and said she was here alone. I was surprised because I know for a fact I heard a male voice when I knocked. I asked her several times and initially thought she was lying to me. My partner checked the house and did not find anyone. The woman said she was reading while sitting on the couch when she heard something over the security camera. She looked at the display and saw two people on the patio, standing at the front door. She heard knocking at the door and called the police. I looked at the monitor, and although it was low quality, I could see the patio and front door area with decent clarity. As the woman continued to explain, the audio on the monitor went from quiet to extremely loud. We all stopped talking. The caller was shaking. I looked at the monitor, but didn't see anyone. Loud audio continued to blast from the speakers. The audio sounded like wind, but it was not windy that night. I asked the woman, "What is that?" And she said, "It's them." I looked at my partner, who was nervous. The woman gave me her cell phone, stating she took pictures of the monitor showing the two people on her patio. I looked through several low-quality pics and didn't see anything. I continued to scroll, and sure enough, I saw what looked like two tall figures standing at the door. One of the figures was holding something. The figures looked strange, all dark and featureless, in contrast to the video I saw on the monitor. I was in disbelief and thought, "Oh my god, she's telling the truth." I continued to scroll and saw one figure holding something up over its head. Another picture showed the item at the base of the door with both figures standing near it. I tried to reason, to explain what could have caused these images, but it was pretty apparent that there had been two subjects on her patio. We checked outside, walking the property to the tree line. I mentioned the movement on the patio and the male's voice from inside the house. My partner asked me to stop talking about it. We finished checking and returned to speak with the caller. She said she would be driving into town and staying at a hotel because she was too scared to stay here tonight. We walked along the driveway back to our cars. My partner jumped into the patrol car and took off. I laughed, but I felt really uneasy standing there in the dark. I left shortly afterward. I was a patrol officer in a large West Coast city for a short period not too long ago. The city I worked for had, and continues to have, a problematic influx of transients. The first thing you learn when dealing with homeless populations is that mental health problems and drug use are overwhelmingly abundant. By the end of my stint, I felt more like an armed social worker than a police officer, and that's one of the reasons I left. I've always been a horror movie buff. After The Conjuring debuted, I bought a copy of The Demonologist, the biography of Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed recounts meeting a homeless man in NYC who spoke as if possessed, p. 219, and goes on to say that prolonged cases of mental anguish can lead to influence from otherworldly beings. I'm not sure if I believe that, but I always kept it in the back of my mind. I do know certain chemical substances, DMT, MDMA, psilocybin, can make the user see or feel the presence of spiritual entities. With so many homeless people having drug addiction problems, I wouldn't be surprised if these kinds of entities, if real, wouldn't find ways to mess with people. One night, on patrol in a two-man car, I was flagged down by a disheveled man standing next to a Winnebago. He told me a woman he didn't know was inside with his son and wouldn't leave. After alerting dispatch, my FTO and I knocked on the door and asked if we could come in. The son said yes, and I stepped inside. The woman looked slightly less disheveled than the son, but I could tell she was either on something or mentally ill. The son was lying very still on a cot, looking absolutely terrified. The woman was quietly mumbling something and fidgeting with empty hands. After trying, and failing, to converse with her, she quickly ran out of the Winnebago. Neither the complainant nor the son wanted to file a report and simply asked us to keep an eye on the area. I agreed, walked back to my car, and slowly drove away. About a block down the road, I saw the woman walking slowly and decided to pull up and try to talk to her again. I was in the driver's seat, and my FTO was riding shotgun. We pulled up. He rolled down his window, and asked for her name. She said it's Rachel and began to mumble louder and faster. The fidgeting intensified, and the only intelligible thing she said was that she's always searching. My FTO calmly and patiently asked her basic questions. Where do you live? Do you know how to get home? Are you hurt or in danger? Etc. But wasn't getting anywhere. At this point, I started to feel a little creeped out but hadn't said anything. Something in her eyes told me this was all wrong. Rachel continued to mumble and fidget, looking down at her hands. I decided to run a little experiment, because I might not get the chance to do so again. And began mouthing the Lord's Prayer. I wasn't actually saying anything, just thinking it and moving my lips. The whole time, I continued staring at Rachel to make sure she wasn't looking at me, which she wasn't, and to make any reaction even more unlikely, I said the prayer in Old English, like Beowulf Old English. That way, even if she glanced up at me, it's highly unlikely she'd understand what I was doing. I finished the part that says deliver us from evil, and Rachel stopped mumbling. She jerked her head up, her eyes went wide, and she glared at me for the longest second I've ever felt before sprinting down the street and into an alley. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily anything supernatural, but it sure as hell creeped me out for the next few days. I used to do armed security in Denver. If you are familiar with the Lakewood area, there is a place called Clare Gardens. Next to that is a retirement community called Francis Heights, and connected to the Heights is a nursing home called Dayspring. The place is rumored to be haunted. I was told that it was all built over an old orphanage that was run by 2 nuns and a priest who neglected the orphans there. Apparently, some of the kids who died are buried there. Some of the ladies on the night cleaning staff were about to quit because they would clean the glass panes on the windows and doors, then return later to find little handprints on them. The residents would complain that they could hear kids running up and down the halls, laughing and playing. There is an indoor gym next door, and my partner and I got bored one night and decided to go investigate to see if anything scary happened. I remember that sometimes in photos, paranormal things can be captured on film that we can't see with the naked eye. I took a random picture of the inside of the gym while my partner was off exploring, and when I looked at the picture, I saw what appeared to be the shadow or silhouette of a person standing there looking down at its feet. I decided not to explore so much after that. I am writing a book about the crazy experiences that happened on the job. People think nothing happens on duty as a rent-a-cop. We have our days too, lol. I used to work part-time as an ambulance attendant for a funeral home that also provided ambulance service. This wasn't uncommon in rural areas back in the 60s. I once witnessed something that convinced me that when a person who is dying begins talking to dead friends and relatives, the spirits of those individuals are actually present. A lady who attended the Episcopal Church literally drenched herself in Shalimar perfume, which, incidentally, gives me a headache. Consequently, I always made certain I didn't sit near her in church, or anywhere else. When she died, her daughter came to the funeral home and, you guessed it, sprayed her mother's favorite perfume on the wrists and neck of the corpse. Several months following the woman's death, her 17-year-old grandson was involved in a car crash and we were called to the scene. After getting him into the ambulance, he began talking to a classmate who had drowned the previous summer and to his grandmother. This isn't unusual because the dying often see and talk to dead relatives and friends. But when he looked up and said "Granny," the entire rear of the ambulance was permeated by Shalimar perfume, so much so that by the time we got to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead, I was getting a terrible headache. My mom used to be a nurse, can't remember what type specifically, but I knew she used to work nights, usually a pretty quiet job. Now, just to clarify, my mom is not in the slightest way spiritual and doesn't tend to spout nonsense, so I believe her. Had my dad told me the story, it would be different, because he's full of nonsense. But anyway, one night, a relatively normal night, the nurses are chilling out, chatting or something, and then my mom hears ramblings from one of the patients. She goes in to see what's going on. The patient rants about some nurse demanding she get out of bed. My mom was originally sitting with the other nurses on the ward, so she knew that none of them did it. Then the patient says, the nurse in the gray uniform was trying to get me out of bed. My mom then notices the bed sheets had been neatly folded back to the end of the bed. She calms the patient down and carries on with whatever she was doing, probably Sudoku. Anyway, this continues to happen for, I think, 3 months. Literally all the nurses sitting, chatting, and then all of a sudden hearing a different patient say, "No, I don't want to get out of bed." She goes in, finds neatly folded bed sheets. The gray nurse was saying that, no, don't worry, you're fine, go back to sleep." I think after 3 months it stopped, but yeah, I remember she hated going to work during that time. Gives me the heebie-jeebies. I used to be a flagger for an oiling crew in the country, mostly dust patches for farms or patches of bad road, just not main highways. Anyways, I had a doctor's appointment around 10 that morning. We weren't too far out from where my doctor was, so my boss told me to take my flagger truck. I drove into town and had upsetting news regarding fertility. He basically told me it would be very difficult to get pregnant, and it pretty much crushed me. I knew I should have taken more time to get myself together, but my radio could still pick up the crew, and it sounded like they were busy, so off I went, brain not in the game. I was looking for my turnoff and didn't realize another, bigger, company's truck had pulled off a bit ahead, so I was coming up pretty fast without realizing. All of a sudden, I hear this voice, like it was right behind my ear, and this voice says sternly, "Look up." I looked, and the driver was out of his truck. I swerved out of the way, narrowly missing the truck and the driver. If I hadn't heard that voice, I absolutely would have hit that guy with my truck. Obviously, no one was in the truck with me, but it still freaks me out a little. My oldest sister was a security guard in the mid-1980s, not really law enforcement, but, you know. Anyway, she was patrolling this shopping center, and there was a somewhat seedy bar in the complex. She used to stop in and check on the bartender during last call to make sure everything was okay, even though it wasn't part of her job. My sister was a rather gung-ho security officer. One night, she walked into the bar and it was just her and the bartender closing up. She told me that both she and the bartender felt as though they were being rushed to get the place closed up. She actually started pitching in to help the bartender, putting chairs up on tables, bussing the remaining glasses from the tables, that kind of thing. My sis had also spent time as a barback and tending bar, so yeah, still way out of her job description, but she was being helpful. Anyway, at one point while the bartender was finishing up in the kitchen, she said it actually felt like someone was physically pushing her towards the exit, and she felt a growing sense of urgency. As she left, the bartender met her at the front door because of the same pushing sensation, almost hearing someone whispering, "Go. Just go. Get out of here." The bartender got in his car and left, and my sister walked off to finish her patrol. About 5 to 10 minutes later, the bar burst into flames, along with half of that end of the shopping center. A disgruntled former employee of one of the other shops attempted to set fire to the entire shopping center. He was actually busted walking from the scene with cans of gasoline. Most of the shopping center survived due to quick response from the local fire station, but the bar, because of all the booze, basically burned to the ground. Working as a phlebotomist in a hospital, I went into a room to draw blood from a patient for a midday draw. I'm specifying the time of day because usually when the sun is down, patients with dementia will forget what year it is, see things, talk to people who aren't there, lose their minds. You know, the usual. Anyway, so midday draw, I enter the room and greet the patient who is wide awake, smiling, and happy. I start to draw her blood, and she introduces me to her husband. I hear the sound of someone clearing their throat from the bench behind me, and for a split second, I wonder how I missed an entire human, because I always greet family. Then, I think maybe he came in right behind me and I missed him. I turn to smile at him and start some small talk, but there's nobody there. That sound came from the bench behind me. The door was closed, and nobody else was in that room. I turn back to the patient who is still smiling and happy but decide not to press the issue of her ghost husband any further. I quickly finish up and leave the room.